I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the chain across the valley road. Not a rusty ranch chain like my father used to hang across the trail when cattle were grazing, but a brand new steel gate with a bright HOA sign bolted to it like someone had decided my entire childhood suddenly belonged to a committee. The headlights of my old Ford pickup cut through the mountain dust as I rolled to a stop about 10 yards from the gate, gravel crunching under the tires the same way it had when I was 12 years old riding up here with my dad on Saturday mornings. The air smelled like cold pine and wet earth, that same quiet valley scent that had lived in my memory for 15 years while I worked construction jobs across 3 states. For a moment, I just sat there with the engine idling, staring at a sign that read Cedar Ridge Valley Association, private property, resident access only. Private property. That almost made me laugh. Because the cabin sitting half a mile past that gate had been built by my grandfather with his own hands back in 1972, long before anyone had ever dreamed of carving luxury homes into these hills. I stepped out of the truck and the night air hit my face, cool and clean at about 40 degrees, the kind of mountain air that makes you feel like your lungs finally remember how to breathe. My boots crunched on the gravel road as I walked toward the gate, and that's when the floodlights snapped on. White beams lit up the valley entrance like a prison yard, and a black SUV rolled forward from the overlook above the road. The driver door swung open, and a woman stepped out holding a clipboard like it was some kind of badge of authority. Tall, polished, perfect hair even in the mountain wind. Rebecca Holloway. I didn't know her name yet, but I would soon enough. She walked straight toward me with the confident stride of someone who had never once been told no in her life. "You need to turn around," she said before I even reached the chain. Her voice carried across the valley road sharp and controlled, the kind of tone people use when they're used to being obeyed. "This road is private property belonging to the Cedar Ridge HOA. Residents only." I looked past her shoulder toward the tree line where the gravel road curved up through the pines. Somewhere up there my family's cabin still sat above the creek, weathered cedar siding, the same porch where my father used to drink coffee every morning while the valley filled with fog. 15 years away, and somehow the place already felt like home again. I rested one hand on the chain across the road, and it rattled softly in the silence. "Ma'am," I said calmly, "I'm not visiting." Rebecca's smile tightened the way a person's does when they think they're about to teach someone a lesson. She tapped the clipboard with her pen and glanced at me like I was some guy who had taken a wrong turn. "Everyone says that at first," she replied. "But this valley is part of a managed community now. If you're looking for the trail cabins, those are another 6 miles west." The wind rustled through the tall pines above us, and somewhere down the slope I heard the creek moving over rocks, the same steady sound that had echoed through every summer of my childhood. I looked back at her and nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch just a little longer than she expected. "That cabin up the road," I said, pointing past the gate into the dark valley. "The one sitting above Mercer Creek." Rebecca folded her arms like she was already tired of the conversation. "Yes," she said. "That one's been empty for years." I gave the chain another small shake, and it clinked against the metal post. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Not anymore." And that was the exact moment Rebecca Holloway lost her composure and started explaining why I wasn't allowed to be here. I could see the exact second Rebecca decided I was not going to cooperate. Her posture changed, shoulders pulling back, chin lifting like someone who had spent years running meetings and telling people what their lawn should look like. The clipboard tapped once against her palm, a small sharp sound in the cold valley air. "Sir," she said slowly, "this community has rules. That cabin you are talking about has been abandoned for over a decade. The land surrounding it is under Cedar Ridge management now." The way she said management made it sound official, like the valley itself had signed paperwork and agreed to be supervised. I looked past her again, letting my eyes follow the gravel road winding up through the dark pines. I knew every turn of that road. At 100 yards, there would be the old cedar stump where my father used to park his truck when the snow got too deep. Another 200 yards, and the creek crossed under the road through a rusted steel culvert my grandfather installed sometime in the early 1970s. And a half-mile beyond that, tucked against the hillside, was the cabin. My cabin. The wind moved through the trees, and I could smell wood smoke faintly drifting from somewhere up the slope. Not from my place, but from one of the new houses they had probably built since I left. When I was a kid, there had been nothing up here but forest, creek water, and a sky so clear you could count every star. It was never abandoned, I said calmly. My father owned it until he passed away. Rebecca gave a quick smile that carried absolutely no warmth. Then perhaps the property taxes were abandoned, she replied. Because Cedar Ridge purchased development rights to this valley 5 years ago. Everything here is part of our residential community now. I nodded slowly as if I were hearing something interesting. 5 years. That explained the gate, the lights, the paved overlook road carved into the hillside above us. Somebody had turned my quiet valley into a real estate brochure while I was working 60-hour weeks pouring concrete foundations 2 states away. I rested my hands in my jacket pockets and looked up at the dark ridge lines surrounding us. The valley bowl stretched almost 2 miles from end to end, a long sweep of timber and creek bed that had belonged to my family longer than anyone in Cedar Ridge had probably been alive. My grandfather used to call it Mercer Valley, though nobody ever bothered putting the name on a map. So let me get this straight, I said after a moment. You built a neighborhood down the road, and now you think you own the mountains around it. Rebecca did not like that sentence. I could see it in the way her pen stopped tapping. I do not think anything, she said sharply. The homeowners association has legal authority over this valley. And you are trespassing. The word echoed strangely. Against the trees. Trespassing. I almost smiled at that one too. Because the truth was I had spent the entire drive up here thinking about my father. About the last phone call we had before he got sick. He had told me one simple thing. Wyatt, no matter how long you are gone, that land is still yours. I looked back at Rebecca and finally let myself breathe in the cold pine air again. Well, I said quietly, that is going to make this conversation very interesting. I watched Rebecca Holloway process that sentence the same way people do when a simple conversation suddenly becomes something else. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she shifted her weight on the gravel like a person preparing to win an argument she had already rehearsed. The floodlights hummed above us, and the night insects had gone quiet, the whole valley holding that still mountain silence that comes just after sunset, when the temperature drops into the low 40s and the wind starts sliding down from the ridge lines. Rebecca flipped a page on her clipboard with sharp confidence. Let me explain something to you, she said. Cedar Ridge is a managed residential development with 214 homeowners. We have approved access roads, community easements, and valley oversight under the county development plan. That means the association controls what happens here. Her pen tapped once against the paper. And it also means people do not just drive in from the highway claiming cabins that have been empty for 15 years. I leaned back against my truck door and crossed my arms, listening to the gravel crunch under her heels as she stepped a little closer to the chain. The valley road behind her curved up through the trees, disappearing into darkness where the pines grew thick along the creek bank. When I was a kid, that road had been nothing but a dirt track wide enough for one pickup truck. Now I could see fresh grading where someone had widened it and cut drainage trenches along the edge. Cedar Ridge had definitely been busy while I was gone. Rebecca continued speaking like she was giving a presentation at a board meeting. When this community purchased development rights to the surrounding valley land, she said, we inherited responsibility for the entire basin area. That includes the abandoned cabin site. The word abandoned again. She liked that word. It made everything sound tidy and resolved. So if you believe you have a legal claim, she added, you can contact the Homeowners Association office during business hours and submit the proper documentation. Until then, you need to leave. The way she delivered that last sentence had the quiet certainty of someone who had never once imagined the possibility that she might be mistaken. I studied the valley behind her again, and a memory surfaced so clearly it almost made me smile. My father standing on the porch of the cabin on a foggy October morning, holding a coffee mug and pointing down the slope toward the creek while explaining property lines to a 14-year-old boy who thought land ownership was the most boring subject in the world. He had walked me down the hill that day and showed me the old survey markers hammered into the rock along the valley edge. Remember this, he told me. People forget where boundaries really are. The floodlights buzzed softly overhead, and Rebecca cleared her throat as if my silence was becoming inconvenient. Sir, she said again, firmer this time, you are trespassing on private community property. I pushed myself off the truck and walked back toward the chain across the road. The metal links rattled lightly when I touched them, cold and new against my hand. I looked at the gate, the bright HOA sign, the wide gravel entrance carved into land my family had walked for 3 generations. Then I looked back at Rebecca Holloway standing there with her clipboard and perfect confidence. "You know what is interesting about valleys?" I said quietly. "Everyone thinks they understand where they begin and end." She frowned slightly, clearly unsure where that sentence was going. I gave the chain one more gentle shake, and it clinked against the steel post in the night air. "The thing is," I continued, "those boundaries were drawn long before Cedar Ridge ever showed up. And Rebecca still had no idea just how big that valley really was." I could tell Rebecca Holloway was not used to conversations drifting outside the lines she had already drawn. Her brow tightened slightly, and she adjusted the clipboard under her arm like someone correcting a document that had been placed crooked on a desk. "I am not interested in valley folklore," she said coolly. "What matters here are legal development boundaries, and those are controlled by the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association." The wind slid down the slope behind her, stirring the tall pines so they whispered together in the dark. The sound carried through the valley the same way it always had, long before floodlights and steel gates showed up at the entrance road. I glanced up toward the ridge again, letting the quiet stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. Somewhere in the trees a branch cracked softly as the temperature continued to fall, the mountain air dropping closer to 38 degrees as night settled in. When I looked back at her, she was already writing something on the clipboard, her pen scratching across the page with the confidence of someone recording a violation notice. "You are refusing to comply with posted access restrictions," she said while she wrote. "That will be documented." I watched the pen move for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You know," I said, "my father used to keep records too." That made her pause for half a second, just enough to show she had heard something she did not expect. I continued before she could speak again. "Old metal filing cabinet inside the cabin. Survey maps, tax receipts, water rights paperwork. My grandfather believed in documenting everything." Rebecca closed the clipboard with a firm snap. "That is wonderful," she replied in a tone that suggested she found none of it wonderful at all. "But the Cedar Ridge development was approved through the county planning office, which means whatever you believe you inherited has already been superseded." The word superseded hung in the cold air like it had weight. I had heard that kind of language before. Developers loved words like that. They made complicated land history sound like a line item that had been neatly replaced by something new. I looked down at the chain again, running my hand along one of the links. It was bright steel, probably installed within the last year. Before that, the entrance road had always been open. Anyone could drive through the valley as long as they respected the land. That had been my grandfather's rule. Rebecca took a step closer, the gravel crunching under her heels. "If you do not leave," she said calmly, "I will contact county security and have you escorted off the property." The word escorted almost made me smile. I glanced back at my truck for a moment, the headlights still shining across the gravel road and lighting the trees like pale columns stretching up into the dark. Then I looked up the valley again, past the chain, past the floodlights, toward the long, quiet slope where Mercer Creek curved through the timber. The creek had been there long before Cedar Ridge. Long before Rebecca Holloway ever held a clipboard. Long before any homeowners association decided it could manage the mountains. I took a slow breath of cold pine air and turned back to her. "Rebecca," I said, reading her name from the badge clipped neatly to her jacket. Her eyes narrowed slightly when she realized I had done that. "You are about to discover something about this place that the Cedar Ridge board probably never bothered to check." She folded her arms again, clearly certain that whatever I was about to say would change nothing. "And what would that be?" she asked. I looked once more at the dark valley stretching behind her, and then back at the steel gate blocking the road. "This valley," I said quietly, "was never part of your development in the first place." And judging by the look on Rebecca Holloway's face, that possibility had never crossed her mind. Rebecca Holloway stared at me for a moment the way people do when a simple sentence refuses to fit into the version of reality they have already decided on. The floodlights hummed above us, and the valley wind carried the smell of cold pine through the gravel entrance road. Somewhere far up the slope, Mercer Creek continued its steady movement over rock and fallen branches, the same quiet sound that had filled this valley for longer than either of us had been alive. Rebecca let out a small breath and shook her head slowly, as if clearing away something ridiculous. "That is not how land development works," she said with the patient tone of someone explaining basic math to a stubborn child. Cedar Ridge purchased the surrounding acreage through a certified development transfer 5 years ago. We reviewed the county records ourselves. She tapped the clipboard again for emphasis. Everything here is legally accounted for. I nodded once, not arguing. I had heard that same confidence before from contractors who believed a foundation was level until the surveyor returned with real measurements. Rebecca mistook the silence for surrender and straightened her jacket. Now, she continued, I am going to give you one final chance to leave the property voluntarily. The word voluntarily hung in the air like a warning that had already been practiced in a meeting somewhere. I turned slightly and looked back up the road again. The valley stretched upward through the trees in a long dark corridor of timber and creek bed, almost 2 miles from the gate to the far ridge where the mountains folded together like the edges of a bowl. The moon had just begun rising above the eastern ridge and pale light was touching the tops of the pine trees. When I was a kid, my father used to say that if you stood at the cabin porch long enough you could watch the moon climb across the entire valley without hearing a single car. I wondered how many homeowners in Cedar Ridge even knew that view existed. You said you checked the county records, I said quietly. Rebecca nodded immediately. Of course we did. I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket and pulled out the old brass key ring I had been carrying since the drive up from the highway. The metal keys clinked together softly in the cold air. Rebecca's eyes dropped briefly to them, confusion crossing her face before she looked back up again. That filing cabinet I mentioned earlier, I said, turning one of the keys between my fingers, is still sitting inside the cabin. She folded her arms again, clearly unimpressed. That does not change the ownership structure of Cedar Ridge. I let the keys settle in my palm and nodded toward the dark road behind her. Inside that cabinet there are survey maps from 1972, 1986, and 1994, I said calmly. Every boundary marker across this valley was measured and documented before the county ever approved a single subdivision permit down the hill. Rebecca gave a short dismissive laugh. You are talking about outdated private surveys. No, I replied, meeting her eyes again. I am talking about the original valley deed. The wind moved through the trees again, and the steel chain rattled lightly between us. For the first time since this conversation started, Rebecca did not answer immediately. The silence stretched just long enough for uncertainty to appear at the edges of her expression. I could see the moment the idea tried to form in her mind, and she pushed it away before it finished. Even if that cabin parcel existed, she said carefully, it would not affect the Cedar Ridge development boundary. I glanced once more at the dark valley road climbing through the pines. Then I looked back at the floodlights, the steel gate, and the confident woman standing in front of it with a clipboard full of assumptions. Rebecca, I said quietly, the cabin is not a parcel. The keys chimed softly again when I closed my hand around them. It is the center of the valley. Rebecca Holloway blinked once, the way people do when a conversation suddenly shifts out of the comfortable script they have been following. The wind moved through the trees again, and the steel chain between us rattled softly against the gate post. For the first time since I arrived, she did not immediately respond with another prepared sentence. Instead, she studied me carefully, trying to decide whether I was serious or simply stubborn. That statement does not make any sense, she said finally, though her voice carried less certainty than before. No single property owner controls an entire valley. That would have appeared in the development filings. I glanced past her again toward the dark slope where the road curved out of sight. The moon had climbed a little higher above the ridge now, lighting the upper branches of the pines with a pale silver glow. When I was younger, my father used to say the valley looked like a bowl of shadow with a rim of light around the mountains. Standing there again after all those years, I could see exactly what he meant. You said Cedar Ridge reviewed the county records, I replied calmly. So let me ask you something. Rebecca folded her arms, clearly preparing another explanation about community governance. What exactly did those records say about Mercer Creek? That question caught her slightly off guard. I could see it in the brief hesitation before she answered. The creek runs through the eastern side of the development boundary, she said carefully. It is classified as a shared natural feature under the association land management plan. I nodded slowly, as if confirming a detail in my memory. Right, I said. And where do you think that creek starts? She frowned a little, clearly unsure why the question mattered. Up in the mountains somewhere, she replied. I turned and pointed up the valley road, disappearing into the trees. It starts about 3/4 of a mile past my cabin, I said. Right where the north ridge curves around and the valley narrows. The floodlights buzzed overhead, and Rebecca glanced instinctively in the direction I had pointed. The mountains rose dark and quiet against the night sky. My grandfather bought the headwater land in 1972, I continued. The entire drainage basin from the north ridge down to the lower meadow. Back then nobody wanted it because the terrain was steep and the road was rough. But he liked the creek and the timber. Rebecca looked back at me again, her expression tightening slightly as the picture in her head began to rearrange itself. I could see the moment the math started forming behind her eyes. A creek headwater property meant upstream control. Upstream control meant land ownership that extended farther than a simple cabin lot. Your grandfather owned a parcel near the creek, she said quickly, trying to simplify it. I shook my head slowly. Not a parcel, I said. The basin. The words settled between us like a stone dropped in still water. Rebecca did not move this time. The valley wind moved through the trees again, and somewhere up the slope a night bird called once, and then went silent. The survey maps in that filing cabinet show every ridge line that feeds into Mercer Creek. I continued quietly. All of it was purchased under one deed because the county required watershed control for the property rights transfer. Rebecca stared at the road behind her again, this time with a very different expression. The chain between us clinked lightly when the wind shifted. You are saying, she said slowly, choosing each word carefully now, that your family owns the creek's source property. I met her eyes and gave a small nod. The source, I said. The slopes around it. I gestured toward the mountains surrounding us. And everything downhill until the valley opens up at the entrance road. The silence that followed felt very different from the earlier ones. Because for the first time since she stepped out of that SUV, Rebecca Holloway was beginning to realize the Cedar Ridge development might not be sitting where she thought it was. Rebecca Holloway did not answer for several seconds, and in a place as quiet as that valley silence can feel louder than words. The floodlights continued their low electric hum above the gate, while the wind slipped down from the ridges and moved through the tall pine branches like a slow breath across the mountains. I could see the calculations happening behind her eyes now, the way confidence starts to wobble when someone realizes they might have been working from the wrong map. She looked back toward the road behind her again, this time not with authority, but with uncertainty. The gravel path that curved up through the trees suddenly looked less like an entrance to a managed community and more like a road leading into someone else's land. That would have appeared in the development survey, she said eventually, though the firmness in her voice had thinned. The Cedar Ridge Planning Board worked with county engineers before the first lot was approved. I nodded once as if acknowledging a point in a long conversation. I am sure they did, I said. But surveys only show what someone actually checks. I lifted one of the brass keys again and let it spin slowly between my fingers, the metal glinting briefly under the floodlights. And sometimes developers assume the land beyond their boundary is just forest nobody bothered to claim. Rebecca shifted her stance slightly on the gravel, and the clipboard pressed tighter against her arm. She was no longer writing anything down. Now she was listening. I looked up toward the ridgeline again where the moonlight traced the shape of the mountains. My grandfather bought that basin because the creek runs all year, I continued quietly. Even in August when most streams in this county dry up. The county required him to control the watershed if he wanted to keep the water rights. Rebecca's gaze flicked back to me quickly. Water rights, she asked before she could stop herself. I gave a small nod. The entire Mercer Creek drainage, I said. From the headwater spring down to the entrance meadow. I pointed past the gate to the slope below where the valley widened into the lower fields now hidden in darkness. Everything that feeds that creek passes through Mercer land. The wind moved again and the chain across the road rattled softly as if the valley itself was answering. Rebecca stared toward the darkness below the ridge, and I could almost see the moment another piece of the puzzle slid into place. Cedar Ridge had been built along the lower valley floor. The houses, the paved overlook, the manicured lawns that probably looked beautiful in the daylight brochure photos. All of it downstream. That would not affect residential property ownership, she said carefully, though her voice had changed now, less like an order and more like someone testing an idea out loud. I rested my hand on the chain again and looked directly at her. It affects access, I said. It affects land boundaries. And it affects the road you are standing on. That sentence settled into the cold night air and stayed there. Rebecca followed my gaze down to the gravel beneath her feet. The road ran straight through the entrance meadow before climbing toward the development behind her. She looked up again slowly. The entrance road easement was granted during the Cedar Ridge construction phase, she said, as if reminding herself of something written in a document. I tilted my head slightly. Granted by who? For the first time since the conversation began, Rebecca Holloway had absolutely no immediate answer. The floodlights hummed overhead and Mercer Creek continued its quiet path through the valley somewhere in the dark beyond the trees. Because the truth she was beginning to understand was a simple one. Cedar Ridge had built its beautiful gated entrance directly across the only road that crossed Mercer Valley. Rebecca Holloway stood very still after that question, the kind of stillness that only happens when someone suddenly realizes the ground under their argument might not be as solid as they believed. The floodlights above the entrance hummed quietly, and the wind moved down from the ridge again, pushing through the tall pines so the branches whispered together across the valley slopes. I watched her eyes drift slowly from my face down to the gravel road beneath her shoes, then out toward the dark meadow beyond the gate where the land widened before the road curved into the Cedar Ridge development. For the first time since she stepped out of that black SUV, the certainty in her posture had begun to loosen. The access easement was part of the construction approval, she said finally, though the sentence sounded more like something she was repeating from memory than something she truly believed at that moment. I nodded once, patient. Construction approvals still require a landowner signature, I said quietly. Someone has to grant the right to build a road across private property. Rebecca opened her mouth slightly as if to respond, then stopped. The clipboard shifted against her arm as she thought about it. I could almost see the conversation replaying in her mind, the planning meetings, the legal documents, the confident presentations where someone had assured the homeowners association that everything had been cleared. Developers like to move quickly when land looked empty. They assumed the mountains belonged to whoever showed up with survey flags and marketing brochures first. The valley wind carried the faint smell of water again, and somewhere in the dark Mercer Creek continued sliding between stones just the way it had when my grandfather first walked this land 50 years earlier. Rebecca finally looked back up at me, and this time there was a question in her expression instead of authority. If what you were suggesting were true, she said carefully, the county planning office would have flagged it during development review. I shrugged slightly. Maybe they did, I replied. Maybe someone decided it was easier to assume the cabin owner was gone for good. The chain rattled softly when I lifted it again, the steel links clinking in the cold night air. Rebecca's gaze followed the sound automatically. The gate, the HOA sign, the bright lights, all of it suddenly looked less like a symbol of control and more like something temporary sitting in the wrong place. You said your grandfather bought the basin, she said slowly. But that would have been decades ago. I nodded again. 1972, I said. County deed number 4871. Mercer Valley watershed purchase. The number meant nothing to her yet, but the way she stared at me told me she understood one thing very clearly now. I was not guessing. I rested my hand on the gatepost and looked past her toward the development road disappearing between the trees. My father renewed the land registration every year until he passed. I continued. Taxes paid, water rights maintained, boundary surveys updated whenever the county changed mapping systems. The wind moved through the valley again, and the chain clinked softly as it settled back against the steel post. Rebecca Holloway looked down that gravel entrance road one more time, then slowly back at the mountains surrounding us. The ridges formed a wide dark bowl under the rising moonlight, the same valley my family had walked for 3 generations. I met her eyes again and spoke quietly. Cedar Ridge did not build inside a managed community, I said. They built inside Mercer Valley. And judging by the expression on Rebecca Holloway's face, she was beginning to understand exactly what that meant. Rebecca Holloway did not speak right away after that. The wind moved through the valley again, and the floodlights hummed quietly above the gate, but the confidence that had filled her voice when I first arrived was gone now. She turned slowly and looked down the entrance road behind her, the same gravel road that curved through the meadow and led into the rows of houses that Cedar Ridge had planted across the lower valley floor. For the first time, she was not looking at it like a community entrance. She was looking at it like a question. I let the silence sit there for a moment. Mercer Creek continued its quiet path somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees, and the cold night air smelled exactly the way it used to when I was a kid sleeping on the porch of the cabin during summer storms. Rebecca finally exhaled and pressed the clipboard tighter against her arm. If the county records confirm what you are saying, she said slowly, then this situation would require legal clarification. The words sounded careful now, measured, the tone of someone stepping away from an argument she had already begun to lose. I nodded once. That sounds reasonable. She looked back at the chain stretched across the road, and the bright HOA sign bolted to the gate. The metal links swayed slightly in the wind and tapped softly against the steel post. A few minutes earlier she had stood beside that sign like it represented authority. Now she was staring at it like it might belong to someone else's mistake. You said the documentation is inside the cabin, she said after a moment. Survey maps, deed records, watershed registration. I held up the brass keys again, and they chimed softly in the cold air. Inside a filing cabinet older than Cedar Ridge, I replied. Rebecca studied the keys for a second, then glanced back up the road toward the dark valley. The mountains surrounded us on every side, rising like quiet walls around the basin. Anyone standing there long enough could see the shape of it clearly. A single valley bowl, one creek, one road cutting through the entrance meadow before climbing toward the ridge. She finally stepped aside from the gate, the gravel crunching under her shoes as she moved out of the road. It was a small motion, but it said everything that needed to be said. I lifted the chain from the post and let it rest against the metal bracket, so the road opened again the way it had been for decades before Cedar Ridge ever showed up with survey flags and development plans. The valley air flowed freely through the entrance once more. Rebecca did not try to stop me this time. She simply watched as I walked back to my truck and started the engine. The headlights swept across the gravel road and lit the pines as the truck rolled forward through the gate and began climbing toward the cabin. When I passed her, she was still standing beside the floodlights with that clipboard in her hand, looking out across the dark valley like someone seeing the land for the first time. The road curved upward through the trees and Mercer Creek followed beside it, the same quiet ribbon of water that had guided my grandfather here more than 50 years ago. I drove slowly through the darkness, the smell of pine and cold mountain air filling the truck again, until the trees finally opened and the old cabin appeared ahead of me on the hillside exactly where it had always been. Some places change over time, but Mercer Valley had simply been waiting for someone to come home.